What does it mean to love a community? What does it mean to ensure access to opportunity, to pave pathways to productive policies, and eliminate ideologies that hold us to the status quo? Some people admire problems, and some people dedicate their lives to creating solutions. You are looking at the latter, at a collective with a purpose, moving past the surface, to be servants of the greater good, shifting structures in neighborhoods that are often forgotten, providing resources to our community's most valuable resources. We are people who believe in people. And don't let other people fool you. We don't just write grants, we change trajectories. We rewrite policy, revive economies, mobilizing for economic mobility. We invest where the rest have divested, standing in the messiness where naysayers and pessimists profess conflicted narratives. Instead of building bridges, we put two in the gap and stand in the trenches. Find us on the front lines, the levees protecting the coastlines, the hands turning soil, urban or rural, proving that philanthropy is a verb, that community and foundation are synonymous. We work across the nation, across sectors, connecting cross streets and corner stores to corner offices and Capitol buildings. Convinced that convening is the precursor to change, connecting experts in the field to experts in the need, with the expectation that everyone can succeed. Planting seeds of equity to grow a garden of prosperity, fueled by a vision where everyone is afforded their basic necessities, a world void of racism, poverty, gaps, and inequities, owning that we can be our own heroes if we face problems collectively.
We are living in the spirit of our ancestry, taking the reins of institutions, acknowledging their contributions to the position where we stand today, holding the keys to gates that were once locked, holding seats at tables that were once myths and fables that could not fathom our existence. But resilience and resistance has always changed the world. We stand on the shoulders of giants, preparing our shoulders for giants, so that when someone admires that I am the first, I remind them I am the first of many, that leadership shows no shade, that representation is essential, that diversity is a catalyst for innovation. Who better to serve the community than a product of its environment? Grounded in community values, committed to increasing our community's value. What does it mean to love a community? It means honoring the value of its residents. It means children with homes. It means adults with access eliminate barriers on pathways to progress. It means seeing ourselves in our eyes of our neighbors, seeing the future in the dreams of our youth, and giving all that we can to make aspirations become truth. How do we love our communities? The truth is, we always have, and we always will. Since love is a verb, we can show you way better than we can tell you. We can show you way better than we can tell you. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible way to open our 2025 community meeting. Please join me in thanking Morgan and Emily with a round of applause. I'm Peggy Reingold, chair of the Foundation's board, and we are grateful that you chose to be with us this soggy evening. This year, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of Youth Grantmakers in Action, a program, that's right, a program that we hold every year to incubate the next generation of young philanthropists. We were honored to have youth grantmakers, Morgan and Emily, join us this evening to read a poem written by Christian Paige for the CF Leads Economic Mobility Action Network, a program that the Winston-Salem Foundation is proud to participate in. Our future is bright with people like Emily and Morgan in it. And what a great segue to reiterate the importance of community-driven philanthropy. For those of you who don't know, the Winston-Salem Foundation was founded in 1919 as a permanent charitable resource that could actively respond and adapt to the community's needs over time. We were the first foundation of any kind in North Carolina, and we are what's called a community foundation. Whereas many private foundations are established from the wealth of a single family or corporation, a community foundation is made possible by the gifts of many donors and community members who pool their resources to leave a lasting legacy together. Another characteristic of community foundations is having a specific geographic focus. At the Winston-Salem Foundation, our proactive and strategic investments are focused on Forsyth County. However, many of our donors have charitable interests in Forsyth County and beyond. At the heart of this work are the people who call Forsyth County home. This annual event has always been a gathering of community, and we have a crowd of more than 1,000 people attending tonight, including community volunteers, nonprofit leaders, elected officials, small business owners, and corporate and professional representatives from all corners of Winston-Salem and beyond. This event illuminates innovative approaches to meeting challenges and maximizing possibilities in our community. In a few minutes, we will welcome Dr. Raj Chetty after a very long day. Thank you for being here, Dr. Raj Chetty. The economist whose 2014 research brought national attention, not great attention, to Forsyth County's challenges with economic mobility. At this time, I would like to recognize fellow members of the Winston-Salem Foundation Committee. This group of volunteers is the Foundation's governing body, and I can speak from my own experience that they are passionate and engaged when it comes to serving this organization, other nonprofit causes, and the community as a whole. I'd also like to recognize the many other Foundation volunteers who are with us tonight, as well as the exceptional staff of the Winston-Salem Foundation. They are talented and hardworking, and we appreciate them. Please join me in thanking all for their service. And you know, we want to extend a sincere thank you to our 28 sponsors, with special appreciation to our presenting sponsors, Goodwill Industries of Northwest North Carolina and Reynolds American, and our community investors, Flow Automotive, Novant Health, Wake Forest University, Wells Fargo, Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and the Winston-Salem Journal. We are most grateful for your support. We are also thankful to our media sponsors, including the Winston-Salem Journal, the Winston-Salem Chronicle, and WFDD. Special thanks goes out to Fox WGHP, who generously hosts a weekly series that spotlights the Winston-Salem Foundation and our fellow Triad community foundations. Tune in every Wednesday for inspiring stories of impact from nonprofit partners and community leaders who are making our region stronger. All of our sponsors are listed in your program. Their support allows us to keep our costs low, enabling greater community access to this event. Inclusiveness is a critical component of what this gathering and the foundation are all about. Please join me in thanking all of our sponsors.
Thank you, Peggy. It is a joy to be in this room with friends from across Winston-Salem and beyond to imagine how we can work better together to build a community where everyone thrives. Philanthropy at its best, and community philanthropy by design, mobilizes people around a common purpose. For 105 years, the Winston-Salem Foundation has been driven by this mission. Though the world is constantly changing, our role as a community foundation is to remain a constant presence, adapting and responding to challenges and opportunities as they unfold. Over the last year, we've spent time listening to community stakeholders and sharpening our focus to be the best community resource that we can be at this time. I am thrilled to announce our new mission, vision, and belief statements that reflect where we have landed. Our mission is to foster meaningful connections and link resources to purposeful action, creating a brighter future for all who call Forsyth County home. We envision a vibrant, sustainable community where everyone thrives. We believe relationships are our most valuable resource. Equity makes our vision possible. Learning is an ongoing journey, and philanthropy is a powerful tool for change. These statements are more than just words. For us, they are our commitment to you and to all residents of Forsyth County to continue working every day to be the best resource that we can be for all of us. These commitments also serve as a sneak peek of what's to come as we unveil our new strategic direction later this year. Economic mobility, expanding opportunity for those who need it most in our community, is a through line across our work. In 2024, our donors made $27 million in gifts to the foundation. These gifts, when combined with support from endowment funds established throughout our history, allowed us to make over $92 million in grants to nonprofit organizations in Forsyth County and across the country, to causes as varied as healthcare, the arts, environment, education, and human services. And we awarded 573 scholarships to help local students pay for college, totaling over $1.6 million in the last school year. We are engaging more local residents in community philanthropy through our 3 strategic initiatives: the Black Philanthropy Initiative, the Women's Fund of Winston-Salem, and Youth Grantmakers in Action. This year is an important milestone as we celebrate 20 years of collective impact through both the Women's Fund and Youth Grantmakers in Action. Our work also takes the shape of deepening our investments to advance equity in education and build an inclusive economy in Forsyth County, providing supports to people in need, but also helping to transform the systems that make this support necessary in the first place. Through impact investing, we are expanding access to capital in communities that have been historically left out, promoting entrepreneurship and affordable housing development. We know that understanding our history and centering the experiences of people most impacted is how we create lasting solutions for persistent inequities. Over the last few years, we've invested in many educational resources to support the community in learning more about our local history, such as the Undesign the Red Line exhibit, the Rooted in Race exhibit, as well as facilitating local research through the Women's Fund and Black Philanthropy Initiative. These resources are on display here tonight in the back of the room. We hope that you will visit them on your way out. We are your community foundation. We share a deep love and commitment to this place. In moments when the national and global news is heavy and disheartening, we take comfort in what we know is constant: the power of our local community. We think about people like you who care deeply about your neighbors. We also think about the inspiring nonprofit leaders doing incredible work each and every day for those who need it most in our community. Alice Walker once said, "The most common way that people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." Friends, at this critical time, we invite you to join us in fueling the people, organizations, and ideas that are powerful tools for change and expanding opportunity in Forsyth County. We are grateful for your partnership, and at the end of this program, we'll share more ways that you can get involved and stay connected. We will also share an exciting announcement of our 2026 community meeting speaker. It is now my pleasure to welcome our presenting sponsors to the stage for remarks and to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy and Latita. Good evening. Good evening. Much better. It's wonderful to be here with all of you for this very important community conversation. My name is Shay Mustafa, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Reynolds American. Now, 2025 is a particularly important year for Reynolds American, or RJ Reynolds. If you haven't heard, we're celebrating the founding of our company. And we are honored to be the presenting sponsor for the Winston-Salem Foundation's 2025 community meeting as we recognize this important milestone. Reynolds' history and our future are deeply intertwined with Winston-Salem. Now, since 1875, we played an important role as a corporate citizen in this community, supporting education, economic development, and upward mobility. We are deeply grateful for the partnerships we've built with many of you in this room, and we remain committed to helping the citizens of Winston-Salem thrive. Now, while we're celebrating the 150th anniversary, and we know this is a time to reflect on the past, we're also very focused on reaffirming our commitment to the future. By continuing to connect, engaging in meaningful debate, and collaborating on action, we can shape a future for the success of all of our citizens. So, whether you are from the public or private sector, for-profit or nonprofit, institutions of higher learning, families who've been here for generations, or you're newly arrived, the reality is that we all have a vested interest in the progress in this community. Together, we rise. So I want to thank the Winston-Salem Foundation for convening this meeting, and Dr. Raj Chetty for sharing or headlighting tonight's conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. On behalf of the employees of Reynolds American and our leadership team, we're excited to continue working alongside each of you and continuing to build a better tomorrow for all of our citizens. And with that, I'd like to invite Barbara to the dais, President and CEO of Goodwill Industries. Barbara.
Thank you, Shay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Maida-Stoley. I'm the President and CEO of Goodwill Industries, Northwest North Carolina. Economic mobility is the heart of our work, and it has been for over 90 years. And our mission to create opportunities for people to enhance their lives through training, workforce development services, and collaboration with community organizations. Goodwill is pleased to be a presenting sponsor of the Foundation's 2025 community meeting, and I am thrilled to introduce our keynote, Dr. Raj Chetty. Raj Chetty is the William A. Aiken Professor of Economics at Harvard University and the Director of Opportunity Insights, which uses big data to study the science of economic opportunity. Chetty's work has been widely cited in academia, media outlets, and policy discussions in the United States and beyond. Chetty received his PhD from Harvard University in 2003 and is one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. He has received numerous awards for his research, including a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, the John Bates Clark Medal, given to the economist under 40 whose work is judged to have made the most significant contribution to the field, and Harvard's George Ledley Prize, awarded for research that made the most valuable contribution to science, or any way that benefits mankind. We are very excited to hear more from Dr. Chetty. Following his keynote, we'll be joined in conversation with local leaders, including Kellie Easton, Tricia McManus, and Mark Owens. Friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Raj Chetty to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you this evening. Thank you so much for taking the time and your interest in these issues. I'm going to talk about data that our team has been looking at here in the Winston-Salem area on economic mobility and its drivers, very much along the themes of what you just heard about in the introductory remarks. But I want to start at a bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which of course has many different aspects to it. But I want to focus in this first map here on an aspect that has been a central feature of the American dream, I think for a very long time, the idea that through hard work, any child, particularly children born into low-income families, should have a chance to move up in the income distribution. Certainly, it was that sort of aspiration that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. And so in this first map, which comes from a study we put out 10 years ago that some of you might be familiar with, that I think drew some attention here in Winston-Salem about its ranking in terms of economic mobility, we analyzed the geography of economic opportunity in America. And I want to start here first by describing how we use big data to construct this map, and then tell you what I think we've learned from it and what we've learned over the past 10 years in particular about economic opportunity. So what we did in this study 10 years ago is took data on all children born in the late 1970s in the United States. In this version, we're taking all kids born in 1978 in America. It's about 3.5 million children born that year. We're using information from anonymized tax returns to map those children back to the exact county in which they grew up and to link them to their parents. We're then constructing the following very simple measure of upward mobility. We're asking, suppose you grew up in a low-income family, which I'm going to define for the purposes of this talk as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. That's a household income of about $27,000 a year. So say you're a kid growing up in a family making about $27,000 a year. How much do you yourself earn when we look at your 1040 tax returns when you're 35 years old? So that's essentially the question we're asking in this analysis, using data from anonymized tax returns on millions of kids, constructing those statistics on average incomes for kids who grew up in low-income families for every county in America. So to give you an example, if you look here in Winston-Salem, you can see that kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, when we look at their own incomes in adulthood when they're 35 years old, they themselves are making still $27,000 a year in their mid-30s. And we similarly construct that statistic for all of the different counties in the United States. We color the map, as you can see in the lower right-hand side here, such that the blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, and the red-orange colors represent areas where you're less likely to rise up, where you're less likely to achieve the American dream. So if you just look at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this map, you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up across different parts of America. There's some parts of the country, like the rural Midwest, for example, take a place like Dubuque, Iowa, where kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later are making $45,000 or $50,000 a year on average. That's a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other places, like Winston-Salem, unfortunately, where kids growing up in families at that exact same income level, one generation later, are not doing any better than their parents were, or in some cases even have lower incomes on average in their mid-30s than their parents did, which, if you think about it, is kind of shocking given the amount of economic growth that has occurred over the past 30, 35 years in the United States. The idea that kids on average would not be doing better than their parents. And so this map on the geography of opportunity, I think, had two important impacts on our field. First, from a scientific perspective, just the simple observation that there's so much variation across different areas in children's chance of rising up itself was an interesting insight, and it gave us a new tool, a microscope, if you will, to study the science of economic opportunity that we've never had in the past. So we now, with this granular data, as you'll see over the course of this talk, are able to analyze what is it that makes Iowa different from parts of North Carolina in terms of children's chances of rising up. What happens when a kid moves from one of these red-colored areas to a blue-green colored areas? Did their outcomes change? Why did they change? You can start to really understand the determinants of economic mobility much more precisely with these sorts of data. Second, and related to that, once we have that better scientific understanding, we can in principle take those findings and make changes on the ground in the more red-colored parts of this map to improve economic mobility there, thereby expanding access to opportunity and restoring the American dream for everyone. And so motivated by that two-part logic, the way I'm going to structure this presentation is in the first half, give you a quick overview of what we and others have learned over the past 10 years about the science of economic opportunity from these sorts of data. And then in the second half, transition to talk about policy changes that we can make to increase economic mobility and show you things that people are doing around the country that may inspire change and be beneficial here in Winston-Salem as well. So 10 years ago, when we did this study, we were only able to look at kids born in the late 1970s or early 1980s because you had to wait till kids were old enough to measure their earnings when they were 35. You had to actually turn 35 by the time we were doing this analysis. Now, thanks simply to the gift of time, 10 years have passed, we are now able to look at how this map is changing over time in America. And so part of the reason I'm here and interested in presenting this data to you all is I think some of you were familiar with the headlines that Winston-Salem and other cities in North Carolina, like Charlotte, ranked among the lowest in America in terms of economic mobility when we were first able to construct these data. Now, it's interesting to ask, how has this changed over the past 10 years? If we look at kids born more recently, how are patterns changing in this region? How are they changing elsewhere in the US? What can we learn from that? And so in a study my colleagues and I put out last year called Changing Opportunity, we set about to study exactly that question. And so let me show you what we found there. Starting first with this map here, which is again for kids born back in 1978, the exact same statistics, but now I'm going to subset the data to focus specifically on white children born to low-income parents. You'll see in a second why it turns out to be quite important to subdivide the data by race when you're looking at these trends. So you can see this map looks very similar to the one that I started out with on the first slide. So now let's look at the same exact data for white kids born to low-income parents in 1992. The color scale is exactly the same. What do you see? You can see those red colors have basically spread across the United States. So in particular, there used to be parts of the US, like much of California, parts of the Northeast, where you had a pretty good chance of reaching the middle class if you were a white kid growing up in a low-income family. You can see by the time you get to kids born in 1992, that's really no longer the case. If you're a white kid growing up to low-income parents in those areas, your shot of reaching the middle class looks about the same or as kids growing up in Appalachia, which, as you may all know, has traditionally had very low rates of upward mobility. And so in that sense, there's a very real sense in which economic opportunity or shot at achieving the American dream is slipping away for a wide swath of Americans. And I think this animates a lot of the public discourse, the frustration, some of the tensions you hear in our society today. Now, we can do the same exact analysis for Black Americans, which is what I'm showing you here. Much of the map is blank because we don't have a sufficiently large Black population in many parts of the United States to construct these statistics. Where we do, we can do exactly the same calculations. We're coloring the map with a different color scale here for a reason that'll become evident in a second. Purple here represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. The peach-orange colors are places where Black kids have better chances of rising up. This is what the data looked like in 1978. Here's the corresponding map for kids born in 1992. And what do you see? You actually see a mirror image of the pattern that we saw for white children growing up in low-income families. It turns out in the data that economic opportunity is improving. Your chances of rising up are improving somewhat for Black children born to low-income parents. And so that's positive news. That's encouraging progress. We're headed in the right direction. I think we should celebrate that and try to learn from it. But I want to make one final point here. While we're making progress in terms of narrowing racial disparities, we should not by any means mistake that for thinking that we've closed racial disparities. And just to make that very clear, let me now take the data that we have in the most recent study for children born in 1992 and simply show you the two sets of maps that I've shown you in the past couple of slides, side by side, Black children on the left, white children on the right. And now you'll see why we put these maps on two different color scales. It's because you still have a completely different set of opportunities for Black kids and white kids in America. The Black kids growing up in the very best places in terms of upward mobility for Black children can expect to have incomes of about $26,000 a year. That is worse than the very worst places for economic opportunities for white children, as you can see in the red colors in the map on the right, where they can expect to earn about $30,000 a year. So in that sense, you have two non-overlapping distributions or two completely different sets of prospects, basically, even though we've made this significant progress over the past 15 birth cohorts or so. And so I show you these maps to start this talk because I think they reflect some of the key dynamics in how economic mobility is evolving in our country, but also because I think they capture two fundamentally different narratives which reflect the debates that we see in our society today. On the one hand, it is true that economic opportunity is slipping away for white Americans. It's improving somewhat for black Americans. On the other hand, racial disparities remain extremely wide in the United States. And so if you look at it from a levels perspective, we still have a very long way to go in terms of including everyone in terms of economic opportunity. And you can see how those two different narratives can lead to different views about what's important for different subgroups and so on. So while often in the public discourse, these are sometimes framed as competing interests, people may have in their minds that perhaps if one group gains, it comes at the expense of the other. A point that I want to emphasize is that when we look at the data, that is absolutely not the pattern that you see. So you may wonder, we're seeing black folks doing better in a number of places. Is that somehow coming at the expense of white folks growing up in low-income families in particular having worse opportunities? And just to underscore that that is not the pattern in the data, let me turn to this scatter plot here, where what I'm doing is plotting on the vertical axis the changes in economic mobility that we're seeing for black children growing up in low-income families from the maps that I was just showing you, here shown for the 50 largest counties. And you can't see the label here on the horizontal axis, but what that's showing is the same change in economic mobility for white children growing up in low-income families in that same county. Now, what you can see here is there's clearly an upward sloping relationship. If this were a zero-sum game, where in the places where black kids gained the most, white folks were gaining the least, this line would be downward sloping, right? But in fact, it is upward sloping. It's showing that in the places where black folks are gaining the most, that's exactly where white folks are losing the least. And so what this underscores is a pattern we see in many different aspects of our analysis, that generally what you see is either everyone rises together or falls together. This is not about one group gaining at the expense of the other. Economic mobility is not a zero-sum game. It's about making progress all together. Now, I've labeled here Forsyth County, which you can see is in the upper right side of this chart. So this is a first indication of what changes in economic mobility look like in this area. They're relatively positive. You're seeing some significant gains in terms of economic mobility for black children here, and you're seeing smaller losses than you see in a number of other places for white folks. Now, that being said, I think things are headed in a positive direction. One doesn't want to overstate the amount of progress. So just to contextualize what that looks like, what we've done in this chart here is shown the data on changes in economic mobility. Here now pooling racial groups, combining white folks, black folks, Hispanic folks, everyone in each area, showing what that looks like for kids born to low-income parents in 1978 and 1992 for 10 counties. Think of Forsyth County and other similar-sized areas in the region. And you can see that indeed, Forsyth has an increase in economic mobility. The Winston-Salem area, is generally getting better, consistent with what I was showing you on the previous chart. And it's better than some other, peer counties like Jefferson, Alabama, and Guilford, and so on. But there are other places that are doing even considerably better in terms of gains in economic mobility. I would highlight Greenville and Spartanburg in particular that you can see there. And moreover, I think another important point to make, and kind of the key message I want you all to take away in terms of just the state of affairs here in terms of economic mobility, is that while things are kind of headed in the right direction in this area, you can see that in terms of levels of economic mobility, unfortunately, Forsyth County remains, near the bottom of the national distribution, as you saw in the headlines 10 years ago. So if you look at all counties in America, if you're a kid growing up in a poor family, this remains a place where it's relatively hard to rise up, a bit easier than it was in the past, and I think that progress is to be celebrated. But there's more to be done, and this is why I think it's great that everyone here is committed to this cause, because I think there can be many further changes made that can expand opportunity for everyone here. Let me show you one final piece of local data on just what outcomes look like. So just to summarize, I've emphasized that economic mobility is falling a bit for white folks here. For black folks, it's improving a bit. For Hispanic folks, you're seeing a fairly significant improvement in economic mobility in this area. So there's some different trends for different subgroups, something you could focus on as you dig into specific sub-communities. But overall, I would say that there are modest improvements, kind of on net relative to the national picture. Okay, so having laid out that background on what economic opportunity looks like, naturally the next question of interest is to try to understand, now that we've seen that there are lots of differences in children's chance of rising up across different subgroups, across different areas, they're changing to some extent over time, how can we use all of that data to understand what actually determines economic mobility and what we can do to change it going forward? So since we put out that initial data 10 years ago, we and numerous other researchers have written hundreds of papers analyzing those data and other variants of that data to understand the determinants of economic mobility. I'm going to just give you a very quick overview of the key findings, starting with this map here, which zooms in to show you the geography of opportunity, not at the county level, like at that national level that we were starting out at, but showing you the exact same statistics now at the neighborhood level, census tract by census tract, here in Winston-Salem. And let me just note, for those who may be interested in looking at data for their own neighborhood, you can go to a website called the Opportunity Atlas. You just Google Opportunity Atlas, and you can go type in your home address or whatever area you're interested in, and you can look at the data for your own hometown. So if you look at the Winston-Salem area, you will see a pattern that I suspect is familiar to many of you. And for those of you who haven't looked at them yet, if you look at the striking maps of redlining in the back of the room there, you'll notice an incredible resemblance to those maps of redlining to what I'm showing you on the screen. It's a pattern we notice here in Winston-Salem and in cities across America. It's exactly in the areas that nearly 100 years ago were denied access to credit that today, if we look at levels of economic mobility, tend to have the lowest levels of economic mobility. Now, why is that? It's obviously not a direct consequence of redlining at this point, since that institution has since been removed, but it reflects the long legacy of historical factors. And moreover, what it shows is that these differences in economic mobility can play out at a hyper-local level. So a very simple point that this map makes is that you can go a few miles down the road in Winston-Salem, or it turns out pretty much any city in America, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of economic mobility. So what does that simple observation tell you? It tells you that the unit of change is not at the national level or in terms of state level policies or what's going on in the labor market in a city. No, often the unit of change is about what's happening in one neighborhood versus another neighborhood, one side of the street versus another side of the street, one school district versus another school that kids may attend. And I think that simple point is extremely important. In a way, it speaks to the message about the role of community foundations and what you all are seeking to do here. It shows that you can create change at this level. You don't need to look only to federal policy or to state policy. It's clear that these issues are playing out at a very local level, which I think should empower all of us in this room to know that we can make a difference, at this level of geography. So how can we make that difference? What is it that's driving these differences in economic mobility across areas? So in a series of studies, we have found, and I'll skip the details here in the interest of time, but we found when we look at millions of kids who move across different neighborhoods, that the earlier you move to one of these green-colored areas in your childhood, the better you do as an adult. So there's sort of a dosage effect of exposure to higher opportunity areas. Now, what is different about these higher opportunity areas? We have correlated these differences in economic mobility with a wide variety of factors. There have been numerous papers written on this. And I'm going to summarize, in the interest of time, the 4 strongest predictors of economic mobility that people have identified. So the first is that places that have higher levels of economic mobility, where kids are more likely to rise up out of poverty, they tend to be places that are more mixed income areas, that have less concentrated poverty, lower poverty rates. Second, they tend to have more stable family structures. So a strong pattern in the data is that communities with more 2-parent families tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better access to schools, both at the K-12 level and in terms of access to higher education, tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. And then finally, we find that places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Now, this term social capital is one that social scientists have used for more than a century. Perhaps some of you have heard it in other contexts. But people have meant different things by social capital in different contexts. Some people mean the strength of a community, what your networks and relationships look like. how many friends you have, how trusting people are of each other, how much people are volunteering. There are lots of different definitions. Now, while people have had the sense that these kinds of things might matter, historically, this is another area where we've had a hard time measuring things, really understanding what matters, how we might change it, and so on. This is another place where big data, modern availability of data, allows us to make further progress. So we had the sense that social capital might matter. We set up a partnership with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook social network platform, to create new measures of social capital. And I want to focus in this chart here on one particular measure of social capital constructed using Facebook data on 72 million users of Facebook that turns out to be really important. So in this slide here, the map on the left is the same map of upward economic mobility drawn using tax records that I've shown you from the first slide. The map on the right is a very different map. It's a map of what we're calling economic connectedness, a measure of social capital that we've constructed using Facebook data, which is a very simple concept. What we're asking is, suppose you're a Facebook user and you have below median income, you have relatively low income, what fraction of your Facebook friends have above median income? So it's just a simple measure of the extent to which low-income folks in a given county are interacting with high-income folks. In the map on the right, the green colors are places where there's more cross-class interaction, where low-income people have more high-income friends, and the red colors are places with more disconnection by class. Now, what you can see is that the map on the right is incredibly similar to the map on the left. There's no need for any fancy statistical analysis here. It's totally obvious that this is an incredibly strong predictor of economic mobility. It turns out it's the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that we or anybody else has identified to date. Moreover, this relationship between economic connectedness and economic mobility holds not just at the national level, but again at the local level. If I zoom in now to look at the data at Winston-Salem, as I showed you before, unfortunately, much of Winston-Salem, here shown at the zip code level, has relatively low levels of economic mobility, and it also has incredibly low levels of economic connectedness. If you're a low-income person in Winston-Salem, unfortunately, you tend to have very few high-income contexts. Now, we find in further work that this notion of economic connectedness really appears to have a causal effect. It's not just a correlate or a predictor of economic mobility, but when you look at changes in how connected people are, it tends to affect their long-term prospects. Why exactly is that? We don't know for sure yet. It might be things like if you're more connected to higher income people, you're more likely to get an internship or a referral to a job that gives you a pathway to success. But at an even deeper level, I suspect that the more important mechanism is something like kids' aspirations are shaped by who they're around. If you've never met anyone who's gone to college or pursued a particular career path in science or business, that's just not on your radar screen and you don't end up going down that pathway. And these kinds of measures are picking that up. Whatever the fundamental mechanism, my sense is this is really a critical factor in driving economic mobility. And so I was pleased to see that relationships are being highlighted in your mission at the Winston-Salem Foundation going forward. This really seems central in driving economic mobility going forward. And so on that note, in the remaining time, I want to transition to talking about how we can use the research findings that I've just briefly shared with you on the determinants of economic mobility to talk about what we can actually do from a policy perspective to increase economic mobility going forward. In our team, Opportunity Insights at Harvard, we are organizing our thinking on these issues into 3 buckets that we think follow naturally from the research findings to date. So to summarize in a nutshell, we think the origins of economic mobility are hyper-local. They're about the neighborhood in which you grow up, from something like birth to early adulthood, to your mid-20s. And depends on factors like the schools you attend, who you interact with, and so on. So if you've got that view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to increase economic mobility going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. So if you know that there are better opportunities to be had a few miles down the road, perhaps we can change our affordable housing policies. Perhaps we can give more families access to opportunity, essentially help families move to opportunity. So that's one approach. Now, this moving to opportunity approach, while I think it can be plausible for some set of families, obviously it's not going to be completely scalable. You can't move everyone. Not everyone wants to move to a different place. And so really, at a scalable level, we need to think about the second bucket of place-based investment. How do we bring opportunity to the neighborhoods where it's currently lacking rather than bring people to opportunity? So That's a second approach I'll talk a bit about. And then finally, recognizing that the key touch point for most kids after age 18 is not the neighborhood or the home in which they grow up, but the institution of higher education they might attend. I think there are a number of things we can do in our higher education system to amplify its impacts on economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes talking about each of these different buckets and then conclude. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. So here, let me start by showing you, again, the map of Winston-Salem, the Opportunity Atlas map. But now I'm going to overlay in these black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. As a bit of institutional background, you may know that in the US, we spend about $60 billion per year on various affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are housing choice vouchers, which give about 2.5 million families rental assistance to find more stable housing, to find housing perhaps in neighborhoods that will give them better chances of rising up out of poverty. Now, when you look at this map, you might notice a puzzling pattern, which is that those black dots are all clustered in the red and orange colored parts of the map, not the blue-green colored parts of the map. And we see this pattern in Winston-Salem, we see this pattern cities across America. Even though we're giving families assistance on the order of $1,000 or even $1,500 a month in some cities, they're not using that money to move to higher opportunity areas where we know from prior research they're more likely to break out of the cycle of poverty. So we're spending billions of dollars on this program, but it's not clear that we're actually breaking the cycle of poverty by providing families with this assistance. So why is that? So when we first put out this Opportunity Atlas data, a number of housing authorities across the United States approached us, including the Housing and Urban Development Agency, and said, why are we noticing this puzzling pattern? Is there something that we might be able to do about it? And so what came out of that was a collaboration in the city of Seattle, where here's the Opportunity Atlas map for Seattle. The black dots are, again, the places where people with housing vouchers are living. You see a very similar pattern. We set up a collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority to see, can we figure out if there's some barriers that might be preventing families from moving to higher opportunity places? Is there something we might be able to do to assist families in moving to these green-colored areas where we think they will thrive in the future that can make a difference? And so we set up a randomized trial where we took 1,000 families that came in to apply for a housing voucher through the standard process. 500 of those families received the voucher. They said you get about 4 months to use this voucher to live wherever you'd like, and they were set on their way. The other 500 received what I would think of as essentially a social capital support, social support intervention, where we connected them with a counselor, a navigator who would help them find housing in a high opportunity area if they wanted to move to such a neighborhood. They connected them to landlords. So again, coming back to the theme of building relationships, right? So you don't just go to the landlord yourself. You have somebody to advocate for you, to help you figure out how to make that transaction. Provided a little bit of short-term financial assistance for a security deposit or an application fee if you needed it. So set this up as a randomized trial. It's kind of like a scientific trial, right? Just follow families over time. Some of them got the assistance, some of them didn't through the flip of a coin. Let's see where they ended up choosing to live. Here's the result of that. In the control group, only 14% of families ended up moving to one of these high opportunity neighborhoods, consistent with the maps that I was showing you. In the treated group that got that additional support, more than half of families end up moving to these higher opportunity areas. Now, just to underscore the magnitudes here, this intervention costs about $2,500 a family. So that's not inexpensive. However, it is a very small amount relative to the fact that we estimate based on our prior work, the kids who got lucky and ended up in the green here, they're going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes than the kids in the control group who didn't get that chance. And so in that sense, by making these small tweaks, in this case, bringing the social support into this existing program, we can make it massively more efficient. We're already spending billions of dollars. We can get a lot more out of that. And I think that kind of thinking can be extremely fruitful in increasing economic mobility going forward. So this is one example. Of course, I don't think this is by any means the only solution or the most important solution to creating economic mobility. So let me now turn a little bit more briefly to the other examples. So in our ongoing work in a paper that we will release later this year, we're now focusing on the issue of place-based investment. Is it possible to transform low opportunity areas into higher opportunity areas? And the way we're analyzing that question is by studying what is perhaps the largest effort to revitalize high poverty, low opportunity neighborhoods in the United States, what's called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, on which we spent about $17 billion over 20 years or so, starting in the 1990s. I'll give you one example here in the Winston-Salem area. If you look at the picture on the left, there was a public housing project, a high poverty public housing project called Happy Hill Gardens. Government invested a tremendous amount of money to essentially tear down those projects and build this mixed income community on the right, which is on the exact same parcel of land, now called Alders Point in Winston-Salem. So conceptually, the question we're asking in this study is, suppose you're a kid growing up in the area on the left, the same exact place when it looked like it does on the left versus on the right. Do your outcomes look any different? We haven't known the answer to that question. We've spent billions of dollars on these kinds of efforts, but we haven't really had the data to know whether that has a transformative impact on how children do. So now with these new data where we've linked information from tax records to HUD data and used various methods to analyze how kids' outcomes are changing over time, we do have an answer to that question. Let me show you that answer, again, the simple slide here that distills more complicated statistical analysis to a simple result. So the way I want you to think about this is, imagine you've got a place that receives a Hope 6 award and is revitalized at a given point in time, marked year 0. So now what we're going to do is look at a set of kids who grew up in this public housing project first 10 years before revitalization. That's that first dot on the left there, where you can see that the kids who were growing up in these public housing projects 10 years before they were revitalized, if we follow them into adulthood, they're earning about $25,000 a year as adults. Now, the second dot shows you what's happening for kids who were growing up there 9 years before the project was revitalized, 8 years before it was revitalized, and so on. You can see, basically, it looks like a flat line around $25,000 a year for all these kids who were growing up in these projects before they were revitalized. Now let's look at what happens for the kids who move in after the projects were revitalized. You see a very clear change in trajectory as the neighborhoods are improving. The same exact kids living in public housing, same parent characteristics, same incomes, they're now doing considerably better, 20-25% increases in earnings, a fundamental change in their trajectory. So that demonstration shows you that it is possible to bring opportunity to a given place. It is possible to revitalize a neighborhood. It's incredibly expensive in this particular case. We're spending billions of dollars, but if you add up the generations of children who are going to benefit from this investment, this is a tremendously high return investment. And so it shows us that changing opportunity is in fact feasible through deliberate policy change. And I think further such efforts, whether through a Hope 6 type of program or other efforts to connect communities, can be incredibly valuable. So in the last couple of minutes, let me touch upon the third area where I think we can make significant progress, which is in the context of higher education and workforce training. So to set the stage here, I want to show you some data on each college's contribution to economic mobility in America. So much as our team has constructed statistics on how every neighborhood contributes to economic mobility in America, we've also constructed publicly available statistics on every college's contribution to economic mobility. And that's what's shown in this chart here. So every college in America is represented by a dot on this chart. There are two key dimensions that matter for a college's contribution to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. It's one way to measure upward mobility. We're saying, suppose you take the set of students who start out in families at the bottom 20% of the income distribution. What fraction of them, when we follow them 10 years after college using tax data, what fraction of them have reached the top 20% of the income distribution? So made the leap from the bottom to the top. So you can see that my own institution, Harvard, for example, or Stanford, MIT, et cetera, they excel on that dimension. The low-income kids who are on campus, the vast majority of them reach the upper middle class or beyond. But when you think about a college's contribution to economic mobility, what matters is not just how low-income kids on campus do, but how many low-income kids you have on campus to begin with. And on that dimension, if you look at those highly selective private colleges in America, they don't look very good. Only 3% of kids at Harvard come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And as a result, just mechanically, it is not possible for those institutions to be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility, to helping people rise up, because not that many of them are starting in low-income families. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the right side of this chart, you can see that we have a number of community colleges in America that do serve many low-income kids. But if you look at the outcomes there, they don't look so great. Kids who attend those colleges don't end up reaching the upper middle class at very high rates. Now, we've highlighted the data for North Carolina colleges here, so you can see that they kind of fit that pattern, right? On the one hand, you have places like Wake Forest, which has terrific outcomes, but serves relatively few low-income kids. On the other hand, you have a number of community colleges that do serve many low-income kids, but where the outcomes don't look as great as we'd like them to. And so conceptually, my view is that the problem in the US higher education system in terms of economic mobility is basically that we don't have any dots in the upper right-hand side of the chart. That's basically a way you can think about what the challenge is for higher education in America in terms of promoting economic mobility. And corresponding to that, you can think about two different solutions that naturally emerge. We can think about how to move those dots that are on the upper left to the right. How do we expand access to institutions like Harvard and Stanford and other colleges that have good outcomes, Wake Forest and so on? Or how can we improve outcomes at the community colleges that are currently serving large numbers of low-income students? And so I want to end by showing how I think that also is something that we don't just have to think about, but is actually feasible to do. I find it useful in cases like this to highlight the occasional exceptions that we see to the general patterns in the data. In this particular case, let me highlight one college that you see there now in the upper right, the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology, which is a very small college in Queens, New York. It does exactly what you'd think it does based on its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology. Why do I highlight that example? It's a good example of what I would basically think of as modern day vocational training. So that's a career that's a pretty high paying career if you go into aeronautics and technology. It's also a career that's apparently accessible to many kids from lower income, middle class backgrounds. And as a result, that college is helping a number of kids at its scale rise up from low income families into the upper middle class. I think we can take a lesson from that type of institution on the kind of educational program that can be effective, perhaps in our community colleges, in other institutions. And just to show you how that can be implemented, let me give you a concrete example of a type of workforce training program that in a sense is trying to do that on some scale, where we're finding lots of evidence of success. So this is one example. It's a program called Year Up. It's an example of a number of recent what are called sectoral job training programs, which train people in specific skills, could be in financial operations, could be in healthcare sector, other sectors. But then importantly, and coming back to the theme that I'm emphasizing in this talk, they additionally provide what I would again call a relationship or social capital support, where they get you an internship at a specific firm looking to hire for that set of skills, give you additional mentorship and wraparound support to kind of help you on the path, above and beyond just teaching you a specific technical skill. Now, this program and a number of others like it have recently been evaluated in randomized trials. And what you see, I think, is really striking. So this is a program where they ran a randomized trial for a group of people who participated in the program in 2014. What we're doing here is using information from tax records to compare the earnings of the people who participated in the program in the green to the people in the control group in the orange. Before 2013, those two lines look basically identical, as you'd expect. Nobody's participated in the program yet. When people enter the program, when you're in the program, your earnings dip because you're in the program rather than working. And then if you look at what happens afterward, you see this remarkable increase of about $9,000 per year in people's earnings just from participating in this program for 1 year that remains stable for years afterward. Clearly putting people on a different economic trajectory as a result of exactly this program, this kind of training. Again, showing that change is possible here in the workforce context. And so to summarize, I've given you some sense of what we've learned about the determinants of economic opportunity, 3 different domains where we can make progress. People often ask me at the end of these sorts of talks, this is all great, very interesting that we can see this evidence that these things can make a difference. But in this current polarized climate, can we actually create change? Does this actually matter? And so let me end with this slide here, where if we look at, I want to give you a concrete example from your own area, going back to Charlotte, North Carolina, which I mentioned at the beginning, one of the cities in America with the lowest levels of economic mobility. When we put that data out publicly, about 8-10 years ago, they also reacted like I think folks in Winston-Salem with some surprise, and they also reacted by wanting to make a difference. And I know there are folks here from Charlotte who've been very much involved in that effort. It's been really inspiring to see how they didn't just talk about these issues, but have really come together to make significant corporate investments in workforce training, to raise a significant amount of money for early childhood interventions, to monitor local progress. And our team has been delighted to be able to collaborate with them on these issues. And I think all of that has amounted to, in the end, significant progress in terms of economic mobility in Charlotte. We're seeing along the lines of many indicators, including this, our data on changes in economic opportunity, that Charlotte is one of the places in America where economic opportunity is improving the most. And so the main message I want to leave you all with here at the end is that change is possible. I think economic opportunity, while it has long-standing historical roots, like you see in your redlining maps, nevertheless is something that we can change through a multi-sector collaborative effort. And I'm delighted to see you all engaged in exactly that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chetty, for those comments and your insights. I think it's filled us all with a lot of inspiration, especially leaving us with a message that we can do something about economic mobility. It is within our local control. My name is Elaine Summerfield, and I serve as the Vice President of Community Investment at the Winston-Salem Foundation. It's a true honor to be here on the stage with Dr. Chetty and some outstanding community partners of ours to serve on this panel and continue with the discussion. Thank you also for being here and choosing to spend your time in this space. I hope that we'll look back on this evening as really a catalytic opportunity for our community. Several years ago, the Winston-Salem Foundation created an intentional focus on supporting equity in education and building an inclusive economy. And in many ways, that boils down to creating a community where everyone thrives. We've directed about $6 million in grant funding towards these focus areas, as well as a couple $1 million in direct financial investments through impact investing in local projects, which is how we are working on advancing economic mobility among a lot of our other efforts. To be able to carry out these efforts, we value our partnerships. We rely on our partnerships, and 3 of our important partners are reflected with our panelists here today. On the end there is Mark Owens of Greater Winston-Salem Inc., where the foundation is partnered to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem and provide opportunities for minority-owned enterprises. Next is Kellie Easton. She's with Action for Equity, where we've partnered to build authentic community engagement and identify ways to support community-led solutions. And then you have Tricia McManus, the superintendent of Winston-Salem Forsyth County School System, which we rely on for programs like our Youth Grantmakers in Action, our scholarships, Forsyth County Teacher Awards, and the school system is a critical partner on efforts such as a school justice partnership, bringing together education, public safety, the justice system, and nonprofit partners to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. Let me begin this conversation this evening by asking each of you what stood out in Dr. Chetty's presentation, and how does that relate to your work in Winston-Salem? Would you like to go first, Mark?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Dr. Chetty, thank you, and welcome to Winston-Salem and Forsyth County. Such an honor to be here with so many friends and familiar faces in the room. And I think the first thing that stood out is you're studying from 1978 to 1992. I wasn't born yet, and thinking about how long it takes to watch this transformation, and thinking about I was 7 years old in 1992 and I have a 7-year-old now, and that we get to take part in building a community that's going to make it just a better place for all of our young people to do that, and how long it takes for a community to really engage in that substantial change. I think also I was optimistic. Anytime there's improvement, it's good and to be celebrated, but it's also an awareness that we have a lot more work ahead of us. But what I'm so optimistic about is rooms like these. These aren't the first conversations that we're having. These are conversations we have with our community leaders, our elected officials on a regular basis. This is not the first time the three of us talk. We talk very often, and having the foundation lead and invest in these critical ways is so inspiring.
Thank you, Mark. Kellie?
Yes, welcome, and thank you, Elaine. So what really stood out to me was the importance of social capital as well as place-based investment. And so with Action for Equity, we believe that community knows what community needs. And so a lot of our work is grounded and centered in community and creating the mechanisms necessary to improve the conditions. And so that really stood out. That is with our partnerships with organizations like Our Opportunity to Love and Heal, our new partner, Partners for Prosperity and Winston-Salem Freedom Schools. We're in Full Circle Mentoring. We are seeing folks on the ground, helping families navigate and connecting them to resources. And so in real time, we are seeing the impact of those changes. And then also just with the community moving it more in that direction, understanding the importance of place-based investments.
Is this on? Yes, it's on. Have to talk into it. So obviously this connected very much to the work in our school system and the work with our partners, with one of the strongest predictors, one of the four being better school quality. I mean, that's a direct connection. And also place-based, thinking about place-based. So we have schools, many of our schools that are in more impoverished neighborhoods. And so what we've been trying to do in that case is to make sure access and opportunity is brought to schools, but also providing access and opportunity where kids can go to magnet programs that might be of interest to them, and just be around students. We always talk about inclusion being so important to us, and so being around students that are different than them, and so that's also very important to us. So when you think about school quality, that's a direct connection to this work. And again, our goal is to make sure every one of our schools has great teachers, has great instruction, has access, that our kids are given access and opportunity. We have a lot of kids that are taking trips to other places to learn more. And that's both in-state and out-of-state, through the curriculum, through resources, through books. I mean, it's just trying to make sure that all of our kids have access. And so that's a direct connection. And so, I look forward to sharing a little bit more through the next responses.
Thanks. Dr. Chetty, I'm curious, you focused on this slide about higher education opportunities and how meaningful it is to have those ways to build skills and knowledge and workforce training. What has your research shown and illustrated related to K-12 education?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much. It's interesting to hear everyone's perspectives. We're very consistent with what you just shared about your schools at the K through 12 level. Some of the earliest work we did, which I didn't focus on here simply in the interest of time, is how your early childhood education has great impacts on later success. So in one study we've done, we look at how kids' kindergarten teachers, essentially randomly assigned to different kindergarten teachers or small versus large classrooms, how does that play out in terms of, if we follow them over time, the colleges they attend, how much they end up earning, and so on. And what you find, very much to your point, is that investments in education at that earliest stage, interestingly, have quite significant impacts in terms of improving outcomes down the road. Now, this may be intuitive, but it was actually somewhat surprising to researchers, because when you look at the data, you see a pattern that people had previously called fade out of educational impacts that you may be familiar with, which is that when you intervene at early years and then you look at kids' test scores, say, when they're in middle school, it looks like the kids who had stronger teachers or smaller classrooms, better resources, they don't appear to be doing any better. But remarkably, what we ended up finding is that those gains end up reemerging when you look at how much kids are earning, their employment rates, their levels of education, and so on. So it goes in a way to your point, Mark, that it takes time for these changes to occur, and we shouldn't sort of give up along the way. I think all of these interventions, even from the early stages, can really matter.
Thank you. Opportunities Insights research definitely points toward, as you mentioned, the place-based investments and working locally. I'm curious, Mark, what have you seen in terms of maybe emerging industries or opportunities for future jobs, current and future jobs? And what is Greater Winston-Salem Inc.'s role in preparing that workforce, ensuring that those jobs can be filled?
It's a great question. It's an exciting time with our programming, specifically for Forsyth Works, which is a partnership with the county, Goodwill of Northwest North Carolina, the school system, and of course our friends at Forsyth Tech, to make sure that there's access. We talked about social connectedness and access to make sure every young person and adult as well has access to the quality skill-based learning and opportunities for those jobs. And our Forsyth Works partnership is showing that. We track our labor force participation rate, which is about 61%. And I think it's an area that we have an opportunity to improve. We're slightly below the national average of 62%, but we're seeing really innovative things like Forsyth Tech's aviation campus, our Major Woodruff Aviation, that may show up on that chart one day, that is right in the community. And it's making sure there's access for students in our qualified census tracts and Title I schools have access to those aviation careers. We're also a community that's built on entrepreneurship. We have companies like Reynolds celebrating 150 years, which was a startup. So how do we continue to support the entrepreneurial ecosystem to make sure everybody has access to those capital options and grants, such as our Minority Business Enterprise grants that we've partnered with, to be able to make sure we're lifting up and helping everybody rise up together on the startup side. But also I'll just talk about hope. You mentioned hope. One of my favorite programs is our Aspire program with the school system. And it's for students in our Title I schools, and we've expanded that, where they go to a World of Work event as an 8th grader, and they get to see 70 different companies and they literally, World of Work, it's called WOW. And that's what you hear all day. And then they go again as a 10th grader. And then as an 11th and 12th grader, they have paid internships thanks to grants from our community to earn up to $15 an hour. Now is the minimum wage, $15 an hour for 100 hours. We had 175 kids go through that program. They all graduated, and some of them got jobs with great companies like Novant Health here in our community right away. But most importantly, they got to see what opportunities existed for them that they may not have seen on Facebook or in the community and that social connectedness. And so I'm really excited about some of those programs and how they tie together with our other partners.
Thanks for that example. It's a great example of how so many different partners work together towards advancing economic mobility for the whole community. And you mentioned one of the key partners being the school system, and that the older students are taking advantage of the opportunities through Aspire. And the school system has a role, as you mentioned, early on to their pathway to adulthood. What about the school system's current and draft strategic plans points towards that path to economic mobility for students? Like, what are those priorities we need to invest in that'll really make a difference?
So first and foremost, what Mark is talking about are the opportunities that we are giving really in high school. And I'm going to kind of backtrack, but those opportunities to level the playing field, to make sure that kids have internship opportunities, have mentors that are in the business community. We have career signing days. We have all these things. We have worked with Forsyth Tech to increase kids having access to dual enrollment. I mean, we've increased that. We've had kids having more access to rigorous coursework, and really we're starting those opportunities for career pathways in middle school. But we have over 40 career and technical pathways, and kids are getting credentialed greater than ever before. Students of color, way more credentials. And so we're things that are happening at the secondary level are really important. But if we backwards map that, we've got to start young. And Dr. Chetty mentioned this, and I know I have other folks in the room that are very, pro pre-K. And it is so important that we start the early childhood experience and have more students have access to that early childhood experience. And so it starts there. And I will just say that pre-K, we probably spend over $5 million of our local funds on pre-K. It needs to really be part of the K-12 continuum and be supported by our state at a greater rate, because We've got to level the playing field, and a quality pre-K helps. And then next after that is literacy. And we have making sure that all of our students can read on grade level by third grade. I know there are a lot of you in this room that are part of that effort. We have a community group working on campaign for grade level reading with many different entities and organizations at the table. But it really is about a strong foundation, early childhood, strong literacy efforts, and then outside of that is just making sure, again, high quality instruction and access and opportunity to extracurriculars, all the things that make the whole child. I recently spoke to the Journal, to Lisa over there, about food pantries expanding all over in our schools. And all of those opportunities are helping to level the playing field for students. And so those are all priorities for us, in addition to continued support around behavioral and mental health. We have got to continue, like we talk about ABCs in the school district, and it's academics, behavior, and culture. You can't separate those three. And so when people try to, when they say, well, you should just be focused on academics, that is impossible, because we're educating children and they all come with varied needs. And so we think about those three things, and that's our focus every day. And so I think it's just continuing to focus on high quality instruction, access and opportunity every day, and leveling the playing field between students that have access just from where they come from and students that don't.
Those different students were illustrated in some of the maps that Dr. Chetty shared as well. And I'm thinking about some of those hyper-local efforts. Kellie, I understand that Action for Equity really came out of building voice and advocacy for a neighborhood to ensure that its local elementary school was a quality school for students and families. And that really, I think, reflects what I've heard you say before about true, authentic leadership that is based in community, people with lived experience, people who are most directly impacted by decisions made by policymakers, by nonprofits, by the schools. Why is that an important approach at this time? How is that different from business as usual?
Yeah, it is. It's actually critical to the success of any, especially during these times, any gains when you're looking at whether that's humane housing, transportation, basic needs and health. The people who are at the intersection of these issues, they have the understanding of the underlying conditions that reinforce the issue, as well as all of the related problems that help keep those issues persistent. And so when we miss an opportunity when we do not create the mechanisms to have authentic community voice. And I'm not just that goes beyond tokenism. It's really, how do you build capacity, and how do you move beyond like our respectability politics and all the things that keep us divided, in order to bring the voices, those who have the experience at that intersection, at that place of urgency, to share the qualitative data that those who are not at that intersection will not understand or cannot see. And so with any challenge that you're looking to create a solution for, then of course you want to be able to hear, how are people experiencing those challenges? And so when you bring the folks who have the experience at the table, then you're not going to only have more innovative solutions, but you're also going to have a greater level of accountability. And then you're also going to have a greater sense of urgency. And that's what we found is necessary in order to make a dent, especially around these persistent inequities.
Accountability, yes. And the accountability and urgency is what we all need to embrace now as we think about how we're going to address the issues related to economic mobility and really advance opportunities for all. Dr. Chetty, I've heard some people look at your research and maybe critique it by saying people are not moving to opportunity. We're really looking at how people are moving away because they can no longer afford to live in a neighborhood that has become opportunity rich. It really is demonstrating more about displacement than actual growth of opportunity for individuals and families who haven't had access in the past. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question that when we think about families moving to opportunity, A, can that be a solution? And B, if we take the complementary approach, which I described, of place-based investment to bring opportunity to a given community, as your question highlights, how can you ensure that the families who originally lived there actually continue to have access to that neighborhood that may now gentrify, that may become more expensive, and so on? And so I think what this goes to show is when we think about developing higher opportunity communities, be it through interventions in schools or other efforts, all of that is tremendously for the good, but I think we also need to be thinking about affordable housing, zoning, and other issues that actually preserve access to these now opportunity-rich communities so that we don't end up just playing sort of a game of musical chairs where we invest in one area, end up having folks displaced only to have lower opportunity somewhere else. And an interesting conversation I had with Jeff Canada from the Harlem Children's Zone, which many of you will know, I think a great example of this, of a very successful intervention that really transformed Harlem. One of the things Jeff told me, which I think really stuck with me, is he regrets not having made investments in affordable housing up front before Harlem Children's Zone became such a success, and Harlem basically became unaffordable to a lot of the families he was seeking to help. And so I think that kind of forward-looking thinking is important as we embark upon all these efforts.
And too often, efforts to expand housing options are met with not in my backyard, NIMBY, from neighbors. And in my opinion, a lot of that stems from the lack of social capital, the lack of social connectedness across differences, and something that we can work to address as a community. Kellie, can you share just a little bit about how Action for Equity builds connectedness across people from different backgrounds?
Yes, I think the one thing I want to lift up or eliminate would be the Thriving Together movement. And Action for Equity, we are co-stewarding that with Love Out Loud and Forsyth Futures, as well as a great team of consultants and all of our grassroots leaders and platforms and folks who are here, including you, Elaine. And so we're creating what's called civic infrastructure. And the civic infrastructure essentially is creating the containers where we can come together in a space to not only understand the problems and the nuances of the challenges in our community, but then also to work towards co-creating some of those solutions. And we take a multi-solvent approach. We focus on the 7 vital conditions. And at the center of that is civic muscle and well-being. And so when it comes to civic muscle, that is necessary, especially when you're talking about addressing the structural changes that are needed. On my way here, I was speaking with someone and we were just saying that the more things change, at times it feels like the more they stay the same. And so thank you, Dr. Chetty, and just saying that you don't want to just shift, your one issue to another issue. And so having a multi-solvent approach gives us the ability to say, like, okay, as we're looking at housing, humane housing, how do we also multi-solve around transportation and learning? And a lot of those interventions are at the place. And so with the Thriving Together movement, we are looking to create those spaces where we're not only breaking down barriers of race, but and especially in these the days coming, really looking at how classism shows up and maintain some of these structures that continue to produce a lot of the inequities in our community.
Thank you, Kellie. Mark, can you share a little bit about how that concept of social connectedness and building it shows up in your work with Greater Winston-Salem Inc?
Absolutely. First, I just want to respond to Kellie. Thank you for sharing that. Transportation is a major issue. We're looking, we've recruited more jobs in the last 5 years than the previous 10 years combined, but we still don't have public transportation to some of our largest employment centers. And that's something that our elected officials, our city managers are looking into and trying to find, how do we create access to where those jobs are, not just the educational component, but the physical access to get to and from those jobs. A great entity, Support Systems of Forsyth County to Forsyth Rides. Those have been grants that have been incredible that help get people right to those job opportunities. And that's really critical so that we're making sure transportation, because that's, our employers are looking for really talented people. And in the Carolina Core and Winston-Salem specifically, when we're recruiting these companies, the people are what really shine. There's dirt and land and buildings anywhere, but our community has a history of making things and being great and starting communities and companies. And that's what these companies are looking for. But we got to make sure we have transportation opportunities so that people can get there. I saw Dr. Richardson earlier, so I've got to shout out his study about, the average individual spending an extra 7.5 hours a week on the public transportation bus system. That's 7.5 hours not at work, not in their community, not doing something amazing. There you are. Dr. Richardson, thank you for pointing that out and bringing that to the forefront. Greater Winston-Salem Inc., our job, our goal is by 2030 to be a top mid-sized city in the Southeast, to be a more equitable community, and to be the best place to raise a family. And I think I'm inspired tonight, Dr. Chetty, to hear that many of those goals line up with what you're seeing to be successful places. And it really shows up in just the social capital, getting to know people by name, getting to work with great events and programs like our Triad Minority and Women's Business Expo, our Reach Women's Network, so many other different organizations that are in this room. We have 6 amazing colleges and universities right here in our community. We have this real great asset with so many of those. I saw Chancellor Brown, I know Chancellor are both here tonight, and really excited to see that continuing to grow. So what we can do is to try to connect. We are co-located with Forsyth Tech. We are in the same building. When we talk about workforce and access and their 18% enrollment increase, we're doing that every day to make those connections. And the more we can know each other by first name and get to really connect beyond just the social media channels, then we really can make a big difference. And that's what I'm excited about.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to acknowledge that this is an amazing conversation, and we could go for hours, honestly. But we are running short on time this evening. So what I'm going to do to close this out is ask each of you, maybe starting with you, Dr. Chetty, what is one thing you hope that people will walk away with this evening?
So, I've shared what I think can make a difference in terms of economic mobility. Let me maybe share a different perspective on why I think we should be interested in these issues, particularly, there are a number of folks here from the business community. I think the reason a lot of us come to these kinds of issues, including myself, is an interest in justice and fairness. Everyone should have a shot of rising up, no matter their background. I think that's a cornerstone ideal of this country many of us share. But I also want to make the point, and I hope people will take this away, that there's just a straight business case to be made for thinking about exactly these issues that we've been discussing this evening. And to make that point, let me just briefly discuss another set of research we've done looking at who goes on to become a successful inventor or entrepreneur, as you mentioned, linking data on patents, for example, to tax records. And what we see there is that if you're from a high-income family, you're much more likely to become an inventor, about 10 times more likely than if you're from a middle-class or lower-income family. You're far more likely to start a successful business, and so on. And why do I make this point here in closing? What this shows is that when we further analyze the data, we find that those differences are emerging because of exactly the factors we've been talking about. A lack of exposure, a lack of social connections, lack of access to high-quality schools, and so on. Now, essentially what you have there is a phenomenon of what we call lost Einsteins. Lots of people who could have gone on to have great discoveries, start great businesses, that not only would give them pathways to upward mobility, but would benefit the local economy, would benefit the entire country through new drugs, new technologies, new businesses that would create jobs for all. And so I would argue, for those here, we should be interested in these issues of economic mobility, not merely to give everyone a shot of succeeding, but to build the talent base that will help your local economy to thrive. And I think that's an important message to keep in mind as we think about financing these kinds of efforts going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Chetty. Tricia, is there something that you hope people walk away with tonight? Maybe a next step or an action we could take together?
I love it, what you said about lost Einsteins. I will tell you, we have 50,000 plus amazing kids that every one of them should be able to go on to do better and to thrive better than their families. They all should be able to, because they've got the potential. And our job is to do what is to level the playing field, make sure they have access and opportunity. And I see that happening on a daily basis, but it really is about every child being seen, valued, and heard. period. Like they all have to feel that somebody is seeing them and sees their talents and can connect them with other resources. And I always have felt like our schools should be like filling the gap, and the community filling the gap where maybe that access may not be happening. So students that have access might have those other opportunities, but then our job is to make sure everybody else that may not gets it. And that's how I look at schools, and that's how I look at our community. And what I will say in closing is, this is a very special place, Forsyth County and Winston-Salem. The people in this room, I've met so many of you, and if any community can get this done, it's this one, and it is because of this commitment to collective impact. You've got Thriving Together, we've got My Brother's Keeper, we've got School Justice Partnership, we've got I'm going to campaign for grade level reading, we've got partners, what? Pre-K priority. We've got the YMCA that is so committed. Like I'm not going to start announcing all of them. I'm going to offend somebody. But there's so much investment. I mean, and I'll say too, our faith-based community is so important in this. I'm sure there are many out there from our faith-based community as well, our not-for-profit space. We can get this done. We've got the right mindset, attitude, and people, and it's a matter of really just coming together and be part of these networks, because we can get it done.
Right.
Well, Tricia, she took my answer, so so I would say, just to build on that, yeah, it's important, and especially now we're seeing how a lot of systems are failing. Some of them are being dismantled, others are being challenged, and so this is while it may feel dark for many, it's also an opportunity for us to lean into the disruption and to consider, how can we build new systems? And there's no better place to start that work than at the local level. What's happening at the, yes, what's happening at the federal level and the state level, we definitely need to keep our eye on that. However, we have so many opportunities here locally. There's so much good work taking place. And so the more we're able to invest our energy and our time and thinking more, like bringing more systems thinking of how we can multi-solve and how do we bring in voices that have typically been left out of the conversations and really work together, and we strengthen our connectivity, then we will build new local systems and we will be able to achieve change. It will emerge change. And, a lot of us are seeing that, at the micro level. But again, it's really going to take all of us. So I would encourage everyone, to get connected. That's what civic infrastructure is about, being able to connect us so we can work together. It doesn't mean everybody will be at the table at the same time, but let's build a big enough, long enough table so everyone will be able to have a seat.
That's right.
Thank you, Kelly. And I would just say that I'm really cautiously optimistic about our future and what we have ahead of us. And I'm excited for when Dr. Chetty comes back in 10 years or so and shares some of the data. But let's be honest, we got work to do. I think it also shared that there's a great sense of responsibility in this room for us to be able to really come together and take the next step. I want to take a moment, go off script a little bit, thank Tricia for her service and congratulations on her retirement. And Tricia stepped in a moment of COVID and time where she didn't come here to be the superintendent and stepped up and led. And with her leaving, we're about to have our 4th superintendent in 8 years. I don't know of any organization that has that much. Can you all hear me? We'll try. Thank you. That has that much change and turnover and can excel at such a high level. So as we embark on whatever's next, call your Board of Education member and tell them that you're looking at data tonight that is looking at kids and what their economic future looks like in mobility. And we've got to really invest in our school system and have leaders that are here ready to take that next step for us. So I'm excited. Thank you. Must be me. Everybody's ready to go home. Thank you.
Mark. So in closing, what I hear about is this is a business case. It makes sense for the whole community. As you said at the top, we all rise together. We need partnerships. We need connections and ensure that we have everybody who wants a seat at the table at the table. We need to invest in our public schools and infrastructure. And I hope that people come away this evening recognizing how these issues are so interconnected. These three leaders represent different aspects of our community, but they're working in such close proximity and partnership because that's how we get this work done. No one entity can do this type of work in isolation. So we just are so appreciative of your collaboration and look forward to more to come. So thank you to our panelists. Now, I just want to say, before you go, Tricia, as Mark alluded to, there is a change in leadership in Winston-Salem, and Tricia McManus has announced her upcoming retirement. And as superintendent, her leadership and collaboration has really meant so much to Winston-Salem Foundation and so many community partners in this room. It's been a game changer to have a leader that builds authentic, deep relationships with students, with families, with teachers, administrators, and beyond. And she leads from the heart. I mean, I don't know how we could have such successful partnerships with our public schools if we didn't have a leader that recognized that there is power, there is so much power in welcoming the community into our schools. And because the schools cannot do it alone. You all know that. The schools cannot do it alone. So Tricia, we just want to say thank you so much for your leadership and partnership. And yeah, wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chetty. Thank you to our panel. I know I'm standing between you and the door, so I will be very brief. It is my pleasure to announce our speaker for next year's community meeting will be award-winning author and the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States, Ada Limon. She will be joining us to share a collection of poetry that she curated entitled You Are Here, Poetry in the Natural World. We are thrilled to welcome Ms. Limon to Winston-Salem to celebrate all of the ways that arts and the environment contribute to building a place where everyone thrives. Please save the date of Monday, May 18th, 2026, here in the Benton Convention Center. If you're wondering how you can move forward with us, please take a look at the code inside, the QR code inside of your program. Please feel free to stop by our exhibits on your way out. If you parked in the Cherry Street garage, please stop and get a complimentary parking pass. On behalf of the staff and the board of the Winston-Salem Foundation, thank you for partnering with us. Have a lovely evening.